Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Following the failure of the last bid brokered by the United States to advance in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, which collapsed in April of last year, new calls to restart talks on ending the decades-old conflict have been emerging from the international community, primarily from the European Union. The current complex situation, however, in which the reality has not changed since the negotiations collapsed, but rather deteriorated, raises questions on the viability of such a bid. With us in the studio to discuss today's topic are Dr. Mordechai Kedar from the Bar Ilan University, who's an expert on the Israeli Palestinian conflict. Welcome. Mr. Max Singer, or Dr. Max Singer, also from the Bar Ilan University at the Begin Sadat Center, an expert on the U.S. foreign policy towards Israel and the Palestinians. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Amir Oren.
Thank you.
Amir, make a little bit sense here, as I don't really see a new reality or a new platform for renewed negotiations. What is the current situation?
Let me illustrate the problem by talking over a similar issue. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter, when asked a few days ago about the fall of Ramadi to the Islamic State, and because there were so many Iraqi government troops there, he was asked, how come? He said, there wasn't any will, any motivation. And if you take it to the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the biggest lack is of political will on the side of the parties. Because you have a certain formula, which, as you mentioned, Secretary of State John Kerry tried to market to the parties last year. And perhaps it could have been acceptable, but there was no political will to implement it. It is not enough for Mahmoud Abbas and Benjamin Netanyahu to come out of the White House and say, okay, we agree in principle, there is a declaration, a framework. They can't sell it to the domestic audiences, and therein lies the problem.
Dr. Singer, when it comes to the current situation with President Barack Obama in the United States about to end his term at office in about 18 months, is there a vacuum right now of U.S. interest in actually motivating the two parties?
I think there still is an interest, but I think it is not as strong as it was before, because they've had bad experience that hasn't worked. And the president prefers putting his time in things that have a better chance of working.
Dr. Kedar, that said, of course, the situation looks like, as we just heard, that there is not a very substantial interest that has lost a focus from the Americans on this regard. But we did see the EU foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini, come to Israel and to Ramallah and wholeheartedly announced that they're interested in playing a major role in restarting the peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. But at the same time, even though we hear both Israel and the Palestinians saying, yes, we're interested, you heard Prime Minister Netanyahu reiterate his commitment to a two-state solution, which he tried to pull back from that statement in the past, not the past future, too long ago. What is the dynamic here? How does this actually come into effect on the ground?
Well, it is more than clear that that's the side which pushes to negotiations and maybe some kind of solution is not the Israelis, not the Palestinians, but the Europeans. It came out very clearly last week in Haaretz, which reported on a meeting in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Israel, where a delegation of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the French came, and they had a very loud, maybe vociferous argument with the Israelis about the whole issue. And the French, and this is what Haaretz wrote, and the French claimed that means the French, public opinion presses us to go forward in this issue. Means not the Israelis press for this, but the French constituencies. Means which become more and more Islamic. They want to see a Palestinian state which might turn into a terror state. Well, who can prevent it? Hamas already won the elections of 2006. What will prevent it in the future again and again? and they took over Gaza by force in June 2007, already 8 years. What can prevent it in the West Bank? Nothing. So that means the Islamic constituencies in France, Britain, many other places are pressing the politicians to press Israel in order to establish a Palestinian state, which eventually will turn into another Hamastan. And this is what pushes the French. They don't care about Israel, don't care about the Palestinians, they care about the adhesive between their backs and their chairs, those politicians. So they come here in order to harvest what will be here in the French street in the elections in France. And this is the whole motivation. They want to sing the song which is being implemented on them or forced upon them by the French street, which becomes more and more Islamic.
Amir?
Perhaps historically the biggest mistake that the Palestinians made in 1948 was to have their refugees stay in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria rather than put them on ships and go to the United States, where they would have become a domestic force, much like the Jewish community. Now, this is, of course, not seriously said, but nevertheless, the domestic influences, which Mordechai Kedar just mentioned, are making an impact. We saw it in the elections in the United Kingdom recently. But it is not only that. It's a matter of priorities. And yes, the Arab-Israeli conflict is not the root cause of whatever is happening in the Middle East. But it is lingering. Even if we solved our problems with our neighbors, the Islamic State would have still done what it does, and Syria would have probably been immersed in a civil war. But you cannot keep it forever in such a simmering state. So it has to be solved, perhaps not right now. Perhaps there is not enough energy on either side to come forward with the grand compromise which is needed on either side, because the Palestinians will have to make some very painful concessions too. Everybody talks about the concessions that Israel will have to make, withdrawing from the borders, evacuating settlements, and so on and so forth. But the Palestinians will also have to say, yes, there is a closure of the books. This is over. We are not leaving any opening for some renewed round of conflict when the time is opportune for us. And it so happens that there is neither leadership nor followership on either side for that.
As I understand it, there is not any discussion in Palestinian circles of the idea of accepting Israel as a state and permanently living in peace with that. That's not proposed by any significant Palestinian group. It's not debated in Arabic. It just doesn't come up. And therefore, we have to assume that the ideas that were Palestinian ideas all the way back to 48, that there should be no Jewish state under any conditions in any territory, that's still the consensus and the operational guide for the Palestinians today.
I would like actually to really dig deeper into this European aspect of the situation. With Dr. Kedar specifically, I would like to start this question to you, to refer this question to you. The Europeans have the largest imports and exports or trade with the State of Israel, the #1 trader with Israel. And they are the largest donor nation to the Palestinians. They have a sense of leverage. Can we see in the near future the European Union take a stand in which they will use this leverage to try and restart something?
They already started it by boycotting all kinds of Israeli products which are made either in the territories or today it's a wave which goes also into products which are produced also in Israel proper, not in the territories, because Israel becomes the problem, not the occupation. It's Israel the problem, and more this issue of boycotting Israel as a whole becomes more and more in Europe. However, the Israeli products or the producers know very well how to divert the market. Now they send to the East, to China, to Japan, to other countries, and the flexibility which they show every time and again. Whenever there is some kind of a boycott, they know how to adjust their products to other markets. And I believe that in the end of the day, look, if you look, let's say, 30 years into the future, Europe is Islamic. Europe is Islamic. You cannot escape this fact. So what do you think, that France with an Islamic majority in 50 years will buy Israeli products? I don't believe so. I don't believe that there will be even a French embassy in Israel. Means we have already to get used to the idea that Europe in the long run is no more. Is no more Europe, is no more with us. And we have to start thinking before we get surprised from this idea, because this is the trend. If you don't stop the immigration, if you don't stop the demography, and nobody really, Europeans do not bring children to the world. When an average of 1.1 or 2 children per family or per woman in France, in Britain, in Norway, in these countries, so sometime the chart or the line will hit the floor.
Well,
Maybe not
50
next
years
year.
is a very long time, and of course it's a speculation.
No, most
on
of the
matter.
viewers will be still there in 30 years. And 30 years, look, pension funds are expected to start collapsing in Europe in 10 years from today. Why? Pension funds are very sensitive to organized work. When people are working not in an organized work, it means they don't pay to the pension fund. The pension fund immediately comes into deficit because they have to pay to the old guys who are sitting at home and waiting for the money, while new workers, mainly those immigrants who don't work in an organized way in large part, they don't pay to the pension funds. In France already they had to raise the age of going to pension from 60 to 62. It was like 3 years ago, more or less. They will have to put it to 65 to 67, otherwise they will collapse. So already you can see the changes which the immigration, Islamic immigration, brings into the European economy, and definitely the waves will come to us.
Amir.
2 points. One, during the heyday of the Oslo process, let's say 15 years ago or so, before violence restarted in the territories, which was Yasser Arafat's fault, there was also a golden age in Israeli-European relations in 2 aspects. One was the Mediterranean initiative, the Barcelona process, seeing Israel as part of the Mediterranean and not only vis-à-vis the EU. The other one was with NATO, with the Atlantic Alliance. But this stopped when Turkey, which is a member of NATO but not of the EU, when Turkey came under the influence of Erdogan and his party, and they have adopted an anti-Israeli policy, which right now is causing a lot of problems in NATO-Israeli relations. So what one can say regarding European attitudes towards Israel, and by the way, many years ago there was what then seemed like science fiction. There was a book called Eurabia or Arabia, right, which fantasized about what would happen in the future. Well, the future is now already. But the problem is that even governments who are basically friendly towards Israel, they have to take into account what happens in their universities, because this is the up-and-coming generation, what happens in their trade unions. Because if longshoremen refuse to take Israeli freight, either off the ship or to load it towards Israel, Israeli trade suffers. And governments know it, yes, it has to do with the domestic implications of demography. And this is why the default is not for the Arab-Israeli conflict to stay dormant. Something will have to be done. Now, whether it will be motion or movement, this remains to be seen.
Dr. Singer?
I'd like to point out that it's not so clear how much Muslim domination of Europe there will be by 2050. I don't think there will be a Muslim majority unless there's a huge flow of many more Muslim immigrants than there have been. And I think that the assumption that a steady rise of Muslim influence ignores all experience with what happens when groups get more powerful. That is, they split. There's disagreements within them, and they don't have the power of unity. And it also ignores the
They
possibility
might
of
split and
backlash.
become more radical, and this is also an option.
Some of them will become radical, and the question is whether that will help them or hurt them. Because anybody who wants to change things has to be a little bit frightening so that you yield to them, but not too frightening so you don't act against them. And that dilemma faces Muslims both worldwide and in countries like France.
I would like to move to the next point of U.S. President Barack Obama, who announced that his country will review, even though they will continue to back Israel on security concerns, they will review and reconsider its policy towards the Middle East, specifically the Israeli Palestinian conflict. First of all, following the remarks made by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu prior to the election, where he A, stated that he's not interested in a two-state solution, and B, also...
When did he say that?
He let Tzipi Chotovely say it on his behalf.
Exactly.
He kept his distance, but this was the message he wanted to put across. Of course, once he won, he took it back. But this was a very transparent political ploy.
My understanding of what he said is something which was true from the
I'll
beginning.
give you in a minute your opportunity to comment on that.
Okay.
The second aspect, of course, is his reference to the Israeli Arab community, which so-called flooded to the polls in order to try and garner more and more power within the left wing within the State of Israel, which were two comments or policies said, if you will, which were very concerning to the international community and the United States. I'm very much interested to understand, is there a new policy towards the State of Israel by the new president, by the outgoing president, if you will, even though he's about to go out? Dr. Kedar?
Well, I'm more than 60 years old. As much as I remember, there was not even one American president who did not announce at least once that he is reassessing the relations with Israel. For any reason which could be. Because it means when you don't have a real policy and everything is based on assumptions, you have to reassess what you do. Because let me tell you, the Americans are clueless about the Middle East. Every day they invent the wheel when it comes to the Middle East. Every day. Once Saddam is their friend, another day he is their enemy. One day Assad is reliable, one day Assad is their enemy after he guesses some people. One day Sisi is their enemy because he ousted Morsi, and recently he's okay because he gets all the helicopters and all these. One day they are in a fight against the Islamists. One day they hug the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, they have no clue about what happens here and how to deal with the Middle East. Every time they try something else and they fail in order to invent another policy, which will fail also. And this is, in my view, this is what characterizes the American policy vis-a-vis the Middle East.
So you're saying those are empty words by the American president?
No, it's not empty words. But this is the meaning. He tries to reassess in order to come to a new policy, which will fail. Mm-hmm. And it will reassess the whole issue, and it will also fail, because they don't understand what happens here.
There is a famous political science model by Graham Allison analyzing the Cuban Missile Crisis, which basically sets out three important dimensions: the national one, the organizational one, and the personal political one. Of course, there are basic U.S. security interests, and there are organizational forces within the administration, as well as with Congress, and there is the personal ambition of Barack Hussein Obama. He wants to be remembered as a great president. He doesn't have a lot of time. As you say, the timelines are in collision, because Netanyahu is just starting his new term in office. Obama is already seeing the new political season, which will start in a few months in Iowa and New Hampshire, and very soon is going to be a lame duck, and he wants to have his imprint. Now, Netanyahu only a few months ago came to the United States and tried to teach Obama a lesson regarding American values. This was a very stinging rebuke. Now Obama is returning the compliment by telling Netanyahu about Israeli values. And Obama waited until Netanyahu formed his government and then chose two outlets. One, an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, and then an address to a synagogue in Washington, D.C., in which to express his views regarding the similarity of the U.S. civil rights movement and what happened when blacks were forced to sit at the back of the bus and all of that, and what happens between Jews and Arabs in Israel. And this is one current in American social and political thinking that Israel cannot ignore. There are more and more blacks and Hispanics and non-whites in general. This is the emerging majority in American society. Obviously, had the elections been held only between white males, Mitt Romney would have won, hands down. But they are not. And the next Democratic nominee, perhaps Hillary Clinton, will also bank on these groups. So Israel has to contend with the reality of a new demography, which Barack Obama happens to represent.
Dr. Singer?
Well, it's also, if you're looking in practical terms, just recently, days ago, the U.S. took a position strongly favorable to Israel in the
Synagogue
NP.
speech.
In the Conference on the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Right. No.
What he did was consistent with prior U.S. policy, but he had moved away from it a few years ago, and he looked like he was going to use that to squeeze Israel, and he, in this most recent, he apparently abandoned that particular measure against Israel.
But 5 years ago, he has done it under Egyptian pressure at the last moment, and there is also consistency in U.S. policy regarding Israel's security, as distinct from Israeli policy in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. For Obama and for every American leader, it is very important to show that the U.S. commitment to Israel's security is rock solid, whatever the debate of the day happens to be regarding policy.
Dr. Singer, please.
Well, in general, you're right, but under that rubric, it's possible to hurt Israel more or less. And a few years ago, the U.S. did something against Israel's interest, and just this week or last week, they did something more favorable to Israel. Whether that just happenstance for this particular negotiation, or whether it represents some limit on how far President Obama is going to go against
very much
Israel.
No, but it represents an American understanding that a mere month before the negotiations with Iran are to culminate, this is not the time to bring into question Israel's own nuclear posture.
Dr. Kedar, last sentence about this. We don't have much time.
I think if we step one step backwards, we see that there is some kind of view in the United States and in Europe as well, that once the problem between Israel and the Palestinians is solved, all the other problems of the Middle East will be much easier to be solved. The Islamic State will be much calmer. Assad will behave nicely. The problems in Libya will, the tribes will sit around one fire and sing Kumbaya together, and all the problems in the Middle East will be solved. So Israel is the key issue for the Middle East. And this is some kind of insanity to think, look, even if Israel evaporates, even if Israel is being erased from the map, what? So the tribes in Libya will kiss each other, the Arabs and Kurds will hug each other, and the Iraqi minorities, the Sunni and the Shia, will solve their problem which started 13 centuries ago. Okay, this is insanity to think that Israel is the key issue in the Middle East, and the peace between Israel and Palestinians will solve or will ease the solution of other conflicts. This is totally detached from reality.
Amir?
So does that mean, if I may pose a question to Dr. Kedar, so does that mean that the status quo is tenable?
Not the status quo, but the question is how to solve the problem. The only solution is Palestinian Emirates in the cities. Gaza is already emirate. We have to establish 7 more emirates in Hebron for the clans of Hebron, another one in Jericho, Ramallah, Shechem means Nablus, Tulkarem, Kalkilia, and Jenin, while Israel should forever remain in the rural areas in order to make sure that we don't have another Hamastan with a territorial contiguity.
I always suspected that Dr. Kedar, deep down, is so much in love with the Palestinian entity that he wants more of them.
I have no problem with 8 Palestinian Emirates because this is the only paradigm which works in the Middle East. The conglomerates of the states fall apart. Small and homogeneous societies remain. Look at the Gulf. The same thing.
We, of course, didn't get a chance to speak about the Arab neighbors and the Arab world with regard to their pressure on the matter of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, especially that there is a certain interest amongst both the Sunni Arab states and Israel to advance in security-related issues, also not only behind closed doors but in front of them. In a very short segment, what do you think will happen in the near future?
I think the only thing which can solve problems in the Middle East is fragmentation of these artificial states which were created by the colonialism and emergence of Kurdish state, Druze state in the south of Syria, Alawi state in the northwest, a Damascene state, an Aleppian state in Iraq, states, emirates, just like the Palestinians, which I preach, because this is the only thing which works in the Middle East. By the way, there is a website which is dedicated to this, PalestinianEmirates.com. Look at this. It explains all the fracture of the Middle East and what is the only future for this unfortunate region.
We're short in time. Dr. Singer, your
I
opinion?
think there's a lot of merit in this idea, but it unfortunately flies squarely in the face of the American ethos, which is a unifying one. And that's a problem for the United States because the reality in the Middle East is there. And if the United States likes to think in a different way, it's not going to be thinking appropriately.
Amir, last
Well,
sentence?
the nation state may be on its way out here, as Dr. Kedar suggested. Israel and Judea were 2 separate kingdoms fighting each other, and many Israelis would like to see Tel Aviv as a separate emirate, as you suggest. Maybe we should leave the studio in Jerusalem and start working at it.
Well, there are very creative ideas coming out of the studio today, so thank you so much, Dr. Kedar, for coming here. Dr. Singer, it's been a pleasure. Amir, Oren, thank you so very much. And I'd like to thank our viewers, and we will see you next time.